So now we're ready to do some shading. Now, when we were sketching this earlier, we were drawing primitive shapes. This is a cylinder for this part of the leg. The lower part of the leg is a cylinder. The head is a sphere, and so on. So when we shade each of these areas, we're going to treat them just like they're three-dimensional primitive objects. So let's go ahead and start with the skin foreground. We'll turn on preserve transparency so we don't paint outside of our flat colors. Let's select the airbrush. I like this because the airbrush makes a nice smooth gradient. I'm going to hold Alt and sample my skin color. And then I'm going to make it darker by going down in my color picker. And I'm going to shift the hue darker towards red. Let's do a test. That might be a little too pink. So let's go darker. Let's go to the left a little bit. Going to the left desaturates the color. So we went straight down to darken, to the left a little bit to desaturate. Let's try that. I think that looks pretty good. So the size of the airbrush will determine the smoothness of the transition in color or the gradient. I'm using a keyboard shortcut of holding Control and Alt and dragging my pen to resize my brush. Now we need to know where our light source is coming from. Let's say it's coming from top right. So I'm going to shade the bottom left of this leg and treat it just like it's a bent cylinder. So it's going to have a shadow side where it's furthest away from the light, and it's going to have a light side where it's facing the light. I'm going to hold Alt and sample this lighter skin color, and I'm going to lighten it by going straight up and to the left a little bit. You want to kind of hug the top side of this color picker here. And I'm going to shift the hue a little bit towards yellow. Let's try that and see with a smaller brush. I think that works pretty well. Putting in a highlight on the leg, like so. Now it looks nice and shiny like skin. And we can do that same thing on the rest of the skin here. You can hold Alt to sample that color. And typically when you're sampling a color that you already put down, it's blended with the color that was underneath it. So you probably will need to go ahead and darken it and shift the hue again. It's better to go ahead and just do all the darks together on all the skin and then do all the lights. That way you don't have any inconsistency in color. So I'm just going to do all the skin foreground real quick. But you want to think about where the light can't get to. The ear's going to block it, the side of the head's going to block it, the hair's going to block it, and so on. Anywhere where the skin dents in or curves away from the light, you want to darken those areas. We'll go to the skin background layer. Let's darken that a little bit. Back to the skin foreground, we'll add a little more shading to the face. Let's go ahead and zoom into the face too. Do a little shading under the eyes and under the nose. Put some in the ear. Let's go to the skin background layer. Let's do the leg here. And now we can start putting in our highlights. So let's just hold Alt and sample our highlight. Let's make it a little bit brighter just to compensate for the blending that occurred there. Let's go ahead and put in some highlight on the leg here. And on the rest of the skin background layers. And we'll jump over to the skin foreground layer and we'll add some highlights. Remember there was that joint there for the shoulder, so that's kind of a sphere that connects to a cylinder. Now this side is facing away from the light, so we're not going to have as much light, but there will be some environment color reflected. I'm not going to put in a background in this piece. I'll just leave the background as white. So I may reflect a little bit of the white background onto her outfit and her skin, kind of like I did here on this side. And typically that environment color is reflected on the side that's opposite from your light source. And it's just a little bit, a little subtle hint. Let's do a little bit of work on the face here. Let's use a small brush to put a little highlight on the nose. Here's a little highlight on the forehead maybe, and on the cheeks. Those are typically the brightest areas on the face. Let's jump over to the hair layer. Let's hold Alt to sample that color. Let's make it darker by going down and to the left a little bit. Shift the hue towards red. And the hair is a combination of a lot of different shapes, but basically it's following the contour of the scalp and the forehead and the back of the head. So you just kind of want to treat it like a sphere, more or less. The ponytail is a bunch of kind of long, stretched out cones, I guess. Let's go ahead and sample the base color that we used for the hair, and let's go up and to the right to brighten it and shift the hue towards yellow just a little bit. And we'll add a highlight here on the top, add a little highlight to some of the strands in the ponytail. Let's go ahead and move on down to the clothing, and we'll select a dark gray. Let's go ahead and start adding some shading wherever we know it's at. So the breast is going to cast a little bit of shadow. The back's going to cast some shadow here. So you could think of this whole torso as kind of a long cylinder. There's a cylinder here for the leg. Let's pick a lighter gray. Let's put in some highlights. You want to think about the points of the highest elevation. Anything that's sticking out a lot is going to be typically lighter, and anything that's kind of sunken in is going to be darker. I'm going to reflect a little bit of environment color on the back side of the suit here. Painting right along the edge with a thin brush. Makes it look kind of reflective and fabric-like. I'll do that right along this edge as well. And let's go a little bit darker, add a little more dark, just to make sure we have a lot of nice contrast here. Contrast is the balance between light and dark. You want to have a good balance at all times so that your piece really stands out. And we can just use a big brush to paint over the whole thing just to darken it overall just a little bit more. And let's blend it a little bit with the diffuse blur blender just to smooth out some of these transitions. Scrub with firm pressure in tight winding circles. And that'll just feather it out and make it nice and soft. Now, one thing I forgot to mention earlier, and that's good because it gives us a chance to check out how to correct more things. If we pull up the perspective guides real quick, let's go ahead and move this center guide down towards the breasts, because the breasts actually are parallel, so we want them to follow an angle too. So you want to try to imagine where the nipple would be, and that will kind of be your center point. And just make sure that there is that same angle with your shoulders, but on this guide here, which would be a little more shallow of an angle. So really the best way to correct this if it's off is go to the ink layer, make sure preserve transparency is turned off for now, and just use the lasso tool to select this little line here for the breast, and then cut it, paste it, and then you can move it around. Now since you move that line a little bit, you may need to go ahead and use the diffuse blur to blend that shadow, or you may need to paint it back in, or repaint it all together. But I think that works pretty well. Now if you want the outfit to look really, really shiny, you can put some really bright little tiny spots here on the breasts. If you want it to look less shiny, you can just go ahead and blend over that with a diffuse blur, and that makes it a less shiny material. Now you have to be careful with this blender, because if I blend over here, I'm going to blend my paint outside the line, and I'm going to blend some of the white in. So try to stay away from the edges with this when you're blending. Let's also add some lighter area on the leg here. I see there needs to be some because the leg's kind of sticking out there. And then let's take a look at doing some tweaks to the shape at this point. So just like we did before, we can hide the color temporarily, go to the ink, and for instance, let's say I want her to be a little more curvy. I'm going to just erase that line, select the scratchboard tool, make sure I have that same point width of 4. And of course, just like last time when we turn the color back on, you can see that we're missing some space. Now, rather than go through and just sample one color and paint it back in, we can do a different trick. Let's select Distorto, and let's just push the pixels where they need to be. Then you can turn on Preserve Transparency, select the airbrush, and you can just paint right along that edge to fix it and make it however you like. Let's go ahead and do some work on the shoes. Let's sample one of these darker colors from the outfit. And where the shoes are facing away from the light, we'll make that area the darkest. And we'll select the highlight color. We'll put a little highlight color on the shoes. We're going to keep the shoes pretty simple, so I think that's about all we'll do for those. And now let's go to the scrunchie and the hair. We don't want to leave that out. Pick a dark gray, and then we'll pick a lighter color. Let's do a little work on the eyes. Maybe we want this person to have green eyes instead. We can just paint over them with green. And on the lips, let's select our lighter pink, and let's use the scratchboard tool to add a little lip highlight there. And back to the eye, let's just add a little white spot, tiny little white spot on the eye for a reflection. And I think that's looking pretty good. Now let's enhance this by adding a shadow. So let's go ahead and add a layer on the bottom of all these layers. Let's call it shadow. Now we're not going to get into advanced ray tracing for shadows here. We'll just kind of draw in one freehand. We'll use the airbrush, and basically you want to think about if the light's coming down, let's say from the top like this, it's going to create kind of a spotlight effect like that because it's going to get blocked by the body. So you want your shadow to be kind of within this shape here, like so, and then you can always blur it if you want with diffuse blur. Go ahead and set the composite method to multiply. Generally for shadows I have it set to multiply, that way it'll blend better with things that are underneath it. So just in case you have a background, that'll make sure that this blends with your background nicely. Now let's do a little bit of tinting over this just to change up the color. Let's go ahead and add a new layer at the top of these layers, and let's call it tinting. And then let's click on where it says color on this group here. Let's select group content. That puts a selection around all of the layers in that group. We'll go to the tinting layer, and we will change the composite method to overlay. Now let's select the airbrush, and let's pick kind of a light blue purple like this. Let's paint some of that on one side here. Let's select an orange, and let's paint that on the opposite side. Now we want to get rid of this selection by doing select none. And you can see it gives it a little bit of a tint. If I turn that on and off, there's a sense of dynamic lighting here. We can turn the opacity of that layer down to get a more subtle blend. We can of course add to it. If we wanted to make a darker area, maybe more blue like that, maybe more orange on this side, really however you want to do it. But I think that changes it up and makes it look a little more natural. And now really the last step is just taking some time to look at this, hunt for areas that look off to you, and go ahead and fix them like I did before. You want to just hide the color, go through and fix the ink first, and then go through and fix the color. And when it's looking the way you want it to, you can go ahead and save your final copy. You'll want to save your master copy as a RIF or a PSD. That way it'll save all of your layers. And then you want to choose Save As again, and if you're going to print this, you want to save it as a TIFF, or a PNG, or a JPEG. TIFF is the best format though. If you're going to save it for the web, you probably want to size it a little bit smaller, and you would want to save it as a PNG or a JPEG. So what I'm doing here is I'm just cleaning up a couple more spots like the neck and anywhere where I overpainted with a line or anything like that. On the stomach, I'm going to kind of tuck that in a little bit and fix that. Really just wherever you see that you messed something up, now's the opportunity to fix it. Alright, so that's how you draw a female jogger using Corel Painter. I hope you enjoyed this lesson.